I think. That's back when George went there.
Yeah, no, he can listen.
Yeah. Go ahead. All right, thanks. We'll call to order the Bedford Township Board of Zoning Appeals regular meeting for January 9th. First, we'll do introduction of the members. We'll start to the far right over here.
Jody Rector, Planning and Zoning.
Phil Goldsmith, Township Attorney.
Katrina Ingram, Planning and Zoning.
Dennis Kohler, Building Official.
Kyle Dersh, Vice Chair.
Jake Lake, Chair.
Bob Potter, Member.
Joe Ward, Township Trustee Representative.
Jeff Wilson, alternate.
All right, next we'll stand for the pledge. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, next we'll do roll call.
Yes, first I'd like to welcome Mr. Potter. He will now be a representative and a member of the board. And Mr. Wilson now is going to serve as an alternate. Tonight he is a voting member. He is serving for Mr. Helm, who is in absence of the meeting, but excused. Mr. Gore?
Here.
Mr. Potter?
Here.
Mr. Wilson?
Here.
Mr. Dersh?
Here.
Mr. Lake?
Here.
All present.
Thank you. Next we'll approve the agenda. Look for a motion to approve the agenda.
Make a motion to approve the agenda.
I'll support.
We got a motion support. All in favor, state aye.
Aye.
Ayes have it. Next, we'll do election of Board of Zoning Appeals officers for 2023. So first, we'll look for nominations for chair, vice chair, and that was it. I would like to make a nomination. I nominate Mr. Dersh for chair for 2023.
I'll support it.
Mr. Dersh, do you accept the nomination?
I accept.
All right. And do we vote now?
Any
Mr.
other nominations? Now you can vote.
Mr. Lake?
Aye.
Mr. Gore?
Aye.
Mr. Potter?
Aye.
Mr. Wilson?
Aye.
Mr. Dersh?
Aye.
Motion carried. And at this time, we'll have Mr. Dersh now take over as chair.
Thank you.
And then we'll look for a motion for vice chair.
All right. Looking for a motion for Vice Chair for the 2023 BZA Committee. I'll make a motion. Oh, go ahead, Mr. Potter.
I was going to nominate Mr. Lake for Vice Chair.
Is there support?
I'll support that.
I'll accept.
Any other nominations? Roll call vote.
Mr. Potter?
Aye.
Mr. Gore?
Aye.
Mr. Wilson?
Aye.
Mr. Dersh?
Aye.
Mr. Lake?
Aye.
Motion carried.
All right. We're looking for a motion for approval of the meeting minutes from those members who are present on the November 14th, 2022 meeting.
I'll make a motion that we approve the minutes of our November 14th, 2022 meeting.
I'd second that.
All right. All in favor of approving the minutes of the May 14th meeting? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Motion carried, no nays. Moving on to new business, looking for a motion to open the public hearing regarding the appeal of 6630 Mitch Limited. The land described as parcel 58-02-035-058-08.
I'll make a motion that we open the public hearing.
I'll second that.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Motion carried. Ms. Rector?
Yes, the applicant is DGBTS Temperance LLC, 5604A Louisiana Avenue, Nashville, Tennessee. The owner is 6630 Mish Ltd, 8160 Sunset, Sylvania, Ohio, 43560. The variance location is a portion of a vacant land located on the east side of Lewis Avenue, north of Smith Road. Portion of parcel 5802-035-05808 on approximately total acreage of 8.86, proposed portion 1.53 acres, C3 general commercial. Section 400, 1904 off-street parking requirements, a variance of 21 parking spaces. The vacant subject parcel is located on the east side of Lewis Avenue, north of Smith Road, on a proposed 1.53 acre parcel. The proposed resulting parcel has approximately 200 feet of frontage on Lewis Avenue. The applicant has submitted a letter dated November 16, 2022, stating the request is for proposed Dollar General having a gross floor area of 10,640 square feet with 844 square feet 8,444 square feet of usable floor space. Per section 400-1904 off-street parking requirements requires one space for every 150 square foot of usable floor space, therefore requires 56 parking spaces. The applicant is requesting a reduction of 21 parking spaces, thus only providing 35 as shown on the Board of Zoning Appeals requested submitted site plan. In the submitted letter, the applicant states it is their contention that any parking that might be provided above the 35 spaces currently planned would rarely, if ever, be used. The applicant continued to state additionally the size of the subject property presents certain challenges that would not allow the project as currently planned to have fully complied with the township's parking ordinance, and to meet those requirements, the proposed building size would have to be dramatically reduced, which would then present a significant operational and financial consideration when determining the feasibility of developing this property. However, the applicant had already submitted a final site plan for review on 9/8/2022, which provided the required number of parking spaces, and I did submit the application and submittal for final site plan. At that time, the planning department had advised the applicant the Board of Zoning Appeals would be supplied the information of the original submittal, which shows the required number of parking is feasible to install, and the board to take into consideration should there be ever a change in use, the reduction in the required number of parking spaces could create a negative impact. Should the variance request be granted, the variance required is a variance of 21 parking spaces. At this time, there have been no calls or letters of objection to the requests. Please note the submittal final site plan has not been presented, reviewed, and approved by the Planning Commission, nor have any approvals been received from the reviewing agencies. At this time, there has not been any submittal for a land division, and should there be any motion to grant the request, it shall be contingent upon site plan approval process and the subject to submitted land division review and approval through the assessing department.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Rector. If the applicant or the representatives up here could step to the podium and state your name for the record, please, and address.
Yes, good evening, and congratulations on the new position. Yes, my name is Jason Van Ryn. I work for Naderveld. Our address is 3037 Miller Road, Ann Arbor, Michigan, 48103. We are the surveying, civil engineering, and landscape architects for this project. I am here on behalf of the developer, as Mrs. Rector stated, is DGBTS Temperance LLC. Tonight, as Ms. Rector already stated, we are here to request a variance for 21 parking spaces for this proposed Dollar General store. I guess I appreciate all the comments that Ms. Rector made, and she is correct. We were able to squeeze all these 53 parking spaces on this site. We had to move some things around, but we were able to make it work. But I guess I'd like to present tonight why we don't need all of these parking spaces. The first thing I want to say is that I just want to talk a little bit about parking ordinances in general. I think that parking ordinances are a very important part of zoning. They set a minimum threshold, in some communities a maximum threshold, for the number of parking spaces required for different types of projects. The downside to parking ordinances is that they group project uses into very general categories, and the approximate number of parking spaces that are required based on measurables like the size of the building in our case, or the number of seats in a restaurant. As Mrs. Rector stated, per section 400.1904 of the Township Zoning Ordinance, our project falls falls under subsection C, which is business and commercial, subsection 1, which is retail stores, planned commercial and shopping center, subsection B for 5,001 square feet to 15,000 square feet, and as she stated, we are required to provide one space for every 150 square feet of usable floor area. So my point here is that this is a very broad description of the proposed use. The type of business that might fall under these criteria is very wide-ranging, and the parking needs for those types of businesses would also be equally wide-ranging. This approximation might be more appropriate if the building that was being proposed was like a shopping center, where the end user or tenant that was going into that shopping center would be unknown when the project was getting planned out. And they may change too over time. Over the lifespan of that building, the people that are going in and out of those tenant spaces would change. So it may be more appropriate to have a more broad parking requirement for something like that, because there's such a wide range of uses. But that is not the case for this project. Dollar General is different because they know exactly how many parking spaces they need for their customers. They know this because they have constructed and operated thousands of retail outlets across the United States. Dollar General knows that 35 parking spaces will adequately service the needs of their customers at peak hours, while limiting the total number of perpetually unused parking spaces. Constructing the additional 21 spaces will add approximately 3,400 square feet of impervious area to the site. This additional impervious area will be of no use or benefit to Dollar General or to the community. It will increase the amount of rainfall runoff and reduce the amount of infiltration. It will require continuous maintenance over its lifespan. And honestly, it's wasteful because they don't need it. Conversely, reducing the number of parking spaces to the 35 that we're requesting would reduce the amount of stormwater runoff, and it would also provide a green space buffer along the north side of the site that could be planted for buffering or and also promote infiltration. So what happens if Dollar General leaves and the use of the property or the building changes? Well, first off, Dollar General signs long-term leases on these buildings. The initial it's a 15-year initial lease, and then they do 5-year extensions. And it is not unusual for Dollar General store to be in operation for over 20 years at the same location. So it's hard to predict how the parking requirements will change over the next 20 years. All cars may be electric in 20 years, and they would require a totally different type of infrastructure. So to build those parking spaces now, to anticipate the next user after Dollar General is kind of unreasonable, because we just don't know what will be needed in 20 years from now. And then secondly, and Ms. Rector, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that if a store were to change hands and the use of the property were to change, I believe that there's, at a minimum, an updated zoning compliance or something like review that the township would have to do. And I think a parking valuation is part of that zoning compliance review.
That would be correct. However, would it be the responsible of the new owner of the property to reinstall those parking spaces? I'm not sure if a variance is approved for that request. I believe it stays with the property, and Mr. Goldsmith can maybe advise otherwise. But if the variance of the 21 parking spaces were granted, it's not granted on the use, it's granted on the property, and it would stay with the property. We would not be able to require a new property owner as a township to install new parking, and Mr. Goldsmith can speak on that as well.
That's right. That's correct. If this is in a C3 zoning district, so if the variance is granted, and you can attach conditions to that, as has been suggested, but if a variance was granted and that the Dollar General use went in there, and then that use over time, for lack of a better term, went away, and another C3 commercial user went in there, or a C2 or a C1, because they could go into that location because they're C1 and C2 uses, generally speaking, are allowed in a C3 zoning district. You may have a building with a substandard number of parking spaces, it's hard to determine when and if that will happen, but that's something you at least should think about in your deliberation this evening. But Jody is right that once the use is permitted and the parking spaces are permitted for that particular use, even through a new user coming in and a new site plan, it's hard to require a new owner or user to create additional parking spaces once that's been established, once the parking space number has been established. That's the dilemma you have tonight. I don't doubt for 1 minute that the representative is correct. Just general knowledge, watching what happens at Dollar General stores as you drive by. Rarely do you see a parking lot that's full at a Dollar General. And it depends on the number of spaces there and traffic in and out and peak usage times. And I'm not camped out looking at them, but the point is, once you grant the variance, it runs with the land, and then you've got an issue if another user comes in with a different type of use that requires more parking. So something for you to think about.
Yeah, that's all I really have. I'm happy to answer any questions for you tonight, and I appreciate your time and your service.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I had one question for you. Knowing that you've got some background in ordinances for townships outside of Bedford, I'd just be curious to know what types of pitfalls you might run into, or maybe some more than lenient parking ordinances in other townships.
To be honest with you, what we're seeing now in the industry is parking maximums. That is people. That's the trend. Municipalities are going to putting a maximum amount of parking you can put. I mean, most businesses, when they come in, they know generally how much they need. They want to provide parking for their customers, otherwise it hurts their business. But what we're seeing is municipalities regulating the maximum amount they can put down because they're trying to limit runoff and improve environmental aspects of the project.
So just out of curiosity, for Bedford Township's sake, I'm going to paraphrase what I think I'm hearing is that what we're requiring is probably a bit much compared to most townships.
I'm probably not qualified to evaluate like where your ordinance is versus some of the other ones. I'm not sure. I think it's pretty. You're probably in line with a lot of ordinances that we see. I'm just saying like for instance, Ann Arbor is one that I'm thinking of. Like they're always very progressive, but they're limiting. They're the first one I've seen that maximizes parking, and like all the townships around are doing the same thing.
Okay.
They're putting a maximum on the parking.
Thank you for entertaining my curiosity.
Yeah, but I think your table is very standard. I don't want to. I'm not criticizing for a general use like a retail center that's just to the north of our site. Say, I think the ordinance and how it's written is probably very good because you have to have some flexibility for different uses that are coming and going in that retail center that may have 10 different businesses. But for this use, that's what's unique about this project is they've done so many of these stores. They know what they need. Price comes into it. Sure, they don't want to build more than they need. They have to maintain it. They have to do all these things, and you have to build stormwater infrastructure to support it. But they also want to provide parking for their customers. If you pull into the parking lot and there's nowhere to park, you're not going to go into the store, and they're not. That's a poor business model too. So that's what's unique about this project. I feel like is that they have so much. They've done so many of these stores. They have so much data. They know what they need.
Thank you.
Real quick too, I guess in terms of changes from the initial site plan that we see in this packet into now, is there a regulation change or something that's driving why less parking is being shown or requested when it was initially shown that it's feasible?
So we wanted to start the site plan process, and we had to provide a plan that was totally compliant because we didn't have. It was just a timing thing. We didn't have time to come to the ZBA. I mean, I could go through the whole schedule, but originally we thought we needed to start the site plan process, so we moved a bunch of stuff around and tried to get all the spaces to work so that we could start that review process with township engineer and the county and all those things. And then as part of that process, we ended up having to do a traffic study, which took a bunch of time. So we decided to come in and see if we could get a variance.
Okay. Are there any other questions, Mr. Gore?
Couple questions. Who is DG BTS Temperance LLC? Who is that?
So that's my client.
No,
They-
but
yeah.
who is your client?
Yeah, it's a company that develops stores for Dollar General. It's not a direct, they don't work, they work for Dollar General, but it's not Dollar General.
Okay, so we're going to dance around the
Yeah,
answer.
I wish he was here tonight. I know Jody's met Chris. He's like one of the owners. I guess I don't know how to answer your question. Like, who is it? It's a group of
Because you got
individuals
somebody
that-
out of Nashville with a Nashville, Tennessee address with the name of Temperance LLC in there.
Yeah, they open a new entity for every store they do.
Of course, they have attorneys that protect them that way, correct?
I'm not an attorney. I assume that's what they're doing. I
Look
just
at Phil over there smiling.
Who will be the title owner of, you have to go through a land division
yes,
process.
it will be
and
DGBTS Temperance LLC.
They'll be the title holder.
They will close on. They'll divide the property, close on the property, build the store, and then I think they own the store sometimes, and they sell the store sometimes. I think.
Okay, so if they build it out, they may lease it to the end user.
Yes. Or sell it to someone else that would own the store and lease it to Dollar General.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, and ultimately it will be operated by the national corporate level of Dollar General. They don't
Right.
do franchises, that sort of thing.
No. They maintain.
Okay.
They do all the maintenance. I got to be careful. I'm not exactly sure how that end of it works. I'm a civil engineer.
Sure.
They're very streamlined setup, right? I'm not sure if they're all independently owned or not. I'm not sure about that. There are a lot of regulations, though.
I'm sorry, before Mr. Gore continues, the public hearing is still open.
Okay.
If you'd like to see if there's any public
Any
comment.
comment?
Seeing there's no additional public comment, looking for a motion to go ahead and close the public hearing.
Motion to close the public hearing?
Support.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right. We'll go ahead and
Okay.
continue with your questions, Mr. Gore.
So I know we're all green and, hey, we're going to protect the planet by eliminating 21 parking spaces and we're going to, not as much rain runoff. But the bottom line is these people know dollars and cents and they know 21 spaces is going to save them some money in this climate. So they're looking for a cost-effective approach to not have to put the 21 spaces in.
Yeah, I would just say again, it's a big corporation. They've, they have a lot of stores that they can evaluate for like what the needs are and what's a successful business model for them. And if they needed to build 10 more spaces and that increased their revenue, I guarantee you they would build the 10 more spaces. They just don't need it. They don't need them. So we have built them in other stores. I've done a few of these now. We've built more spaces on their stores, but they don't get used.
How did they end up in Temperance when there's 2 more Dollar Generals within 3 miles?
People ask me that. I'm just the civil engineer, unfortunately. I don't know how they do their site selections. I don't know any of that.
So we've had parking spaces issue come before the board in the past. The most recent one was the big apartment complex, and I wasn't willing to grant a variance for them, and I'm not, I want my parking spaces. So that's where I stand.
A couple of questions more for Jody and maybe Phil a little bit here. First, you said it pretty quick, but you mentioned there's some contingencies. So this is also a land split as well?
Yes, this parcel is being proposed for a land division subject to, I believe, I'm not 100% sure on the contract with the property owner potential and with the existing property owner, but I believe that's the contingencies on going through the site plan and why the applicant was on a time frame for the submittal of the site plan to continue it to move forward. but it will go through a site plan. The overall parcel at this time is the 8.86 acres, and they're looking to carve off the 1.53. And I believe if you look at the front page of the C100, it shows you the entire parcel and the proposed site that they're proposing.
Yeah,
And it-
obviously, that's not up for debate. I just wanted to make sure I understood the contingencies. It's land split and site approval.
Yes, they have not gotten site plan approval from the Planning Commission yet. I advised Mr. Van Ryn that whatever proposal, they have to submit that for approval if they're going to change the parking. When they submitted with the overall 56 parking spaces, the Drain Commission for stormwater runoff, Mannequin Smith as a township engineer needed to see what they're proposing to do a review. However, should the variance be granted tonight, they will have to resubmit because there is a change in the site plan as well.
Okay. And then the second question, Phil, or Mr. Goldsmith, you kind of mentioned this already a little bit. Future use would be subject to whatever, if we were to approve the 35 spaces, right? Future uses would also be subject to only those 35. So would that reduce the amount of opportunities for potential future owners of this property?
I would think it would, from the standpoint that a new user is going to want to have a sufficient number of parking spaces to support their business. And you address that. It doesn't make sense to have an insufficient number of parking spaces. There are establishments within Bedford Township that are popular that people drive right by, most notably restaurants, because the parking lot is full and there's no place to park. So it could reduce potential future uses. So if the board is inclined to give consideration to the variance request, just thinking out of the box here, this board is a quasi-judicial board, and you can attach reasonable conditions to any variance that you grant. One way to think about this is that you could put a condition on that if the use changes or ownership of the parcel changes and a new use goes in, even if it's 20 years from now, and it's a use that requires more parking spaces, this parcel would be required to have a sufficient amount of area, whether it be in a green space or otherwise, to add additional parking spaces for a new commercial use based on a new site plan. So take a little wordsmithing to put that in, but that's something to think about. Like I said earlier, I think your presenter tonight is probably accurate in terms of how many spaces are needed for this particular use, but there's a lot of other uses that can go in that C3 district when they're done with it. And there's a lot of things that drive how long they'll be there and when they will be done with it, market demand and the like. So, you have to take all of that into consideration, I think. You start with the proposition that you have an ordinance. This is what the ordinance requires. Is there a practical difficulty that would allow you, as the board, to deviate from that? So I don't want to lose sight of the process here.
Mr. Potter?
A comment more than a question. Appropriate or not, the Dollar General down the road has 64 spaces. So the model that they were using might have been different whenever that place was built. I don't know.
Or they didn't go in for variance, I mean.
Or, yeah, that.
Yeah, I don't think there's two Dollar Generals, Bob, within
I'm on
Bedford.
Lewis Avenue at Dean.
Yeah, that one, Lewis Avenue near Dean, and then there's the one on Summerfield near Stearns. That was a conditional zoning, the Summerfield and Stearns one, right?
Yes.
Okay, but both of those stores have been laid out, to my understanding, with the number of parking spaces required by the zoning ordinance based on the square footage, the usable floor space of the establishment. So I think you're right. I don't think they came and asked for a variance for either of those locations.
Thank you.
Oh, and it was denied? Oh, I've been corrected. The one on Lewis Avenue near Dean did ask for a variance in 2006 or 5? 2006, and it was denied.
I guess that's kind of where I'm at with this, is I'm struggling to find a practical difficulty here that's driving this request, or, you know, something that's not self-created, that's a part of the land itself that would prohibit these additional parking spots.
Well, I mean, I'll take a stab at a practical difficulty, and we can have some healthy debate here. But you know, I would agree on the status that, you know, there's 3,400 square feet of unneeded parking, right? Why would we build it if we don't need it? So I think that that's part of that, you know, increased water runoff, green space buffer. I believe in all of that. I think that that's appropriate. I think it's wasteful to produce extra spots or extra spaces that are unneeded. So quite honestly, I think that's a practical difficulty.
I tend to agree, I think, with Jake's comments, at least for this particular business. I like the fact, Phil, that you had mentioned that we may be able to, you know, attach amendments that allow then, in the case that the usage changes, to reevaluate. Because, again, and I know everything, again, has to be on its own merit, but if you are talking about the other locations in town, I specifically know, say, the Summerfield location. I mean, where they're, and I don't park out there either and watch, but right, when do you see more than 10 people there? Or whatever. I mean, there is, say if there's 50 parking spaces, I've never seen, I go by there, you know, half a dozen times a week, and when have you ever seen anybody with a car facing towards the road, right? So I would tend to kind of agree, at least for this particular usage and this particular tenant, that it seems to make sense. But I do like the idea that we can potentially, if we decide to go that way, attach, you know, an amendment that would allow for you know, that to be reevaluated should another client come in that needs, you know, 50 spaces or 60 spaces.
If somebody's going to take a stab at a motion, and got to make sure it's got everything in it, because we don't need 30 years from now, when, of course, none of us will be on the board then. But again, Phil, going back to a variance that our lady came before the township board requesting us to repeal a variance that was created back in the 70s. And we couldn't do anything. Once this board rules, it rules. We don't want to saddle a future board, you know, 30 years from now
With an issue.
And if, you know, and if we need to change with the times, maybe we need to take a look at the ordinance and, you know, I don't know how we do that or who looks at them.
The Planning Commission, I mean, it's, and he's right, that a lot of more progressive, I don't want to say Bedford's not progressive, that's not accurate, but when you're in a densely populated metropolitan area like Ann Arbor, I'll characterize it as such, that, and there's a different way of thinking that they've gone to the maximum number in recognition that the developer knows what they need and they don't want to understate it, because that would be a bad business model and it would interfere with having customers come and visit their establishment. So it would take our planning commission to look at that and say, okay, in our area, in our community, which has been rural, but, you know, we're moving in the opposite direction, or in a direction of more densely populated for a lot of different reasons. Do we need to rethink this situation? If you look at just down the street, where 734 is at one end and the barbecue restaurant, and at the other end the diner, they have parking issues there. and they've got a situation where they're parking on an adjacent parcel. And sometimes two different establishments will agree to share parking, and sometimes they won't. And then you've got a problem. So you're right about making sure that the motion is crafted precisely, because once this board makes its decision, it's final. It can be appealed, as you all know, by an aggrieved party, and there's a real close definition now that has recently come out by the Michigan Supreme Court as who or what constitutes an aggrieved party. That appeal could go to circuit court, and your decision could be affirmed, it could be reversed, or it could be sent back here for further deliberation. But once a decision is made, and you gave that, it's a very good example going back to the 70s, this board doesn't have the ability to change that decision, nor does a township board, because this board acts as a quasi-judicial body. Its decision is final unless it's timely appealed and reversed. So you need to make sure that it's precisely stated.
Well, like you say with parking, the little strip mall to the north of that, I'm in there quite a bit, and that's always full over in there. Is there any, and probably not, but there's any plans to connect those two with like a little drive between the two, or no?
That hasn't been discussed. We're not through the site plan process yet.
Right.
We've only gone through one review. Right now, to meet the number of required parking spaces, there's actually parking all along that whole north side. I mean, there would be more ability if we didn't, like this plan shows just the 35 spaces. There would, some agreement would have to be worked out here.
Right.
But there's the ability to do it here too. But
Right.
I just wanted to just point out that in the future, like if a new tenant in 20 years or whatever comes in and they make it a restaurant or whatever the uses allow, and they wanted to add parking, they would have the ability to add some spaces here, if it would help their business. But they, depending on what motion you make, they may not be required to, but they may want to, and they would have that space to do that.
The places that have their parking problems do put in the parking that they can get put in.
Dennis, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, is it okay to have this dialogue?
All right.
Okay. Dennis, are you suggesting perhaps that on the site plan, all 56 spaces be shown?
I was going to suggest that because that if the new tenant or add as a condition, should the desire be to approve it, that the Drain Commission has to take a look, because our ordinance only allows 1,000 square feet or 10% of the structure. So I would like, if there's any desire to do so, that the Drain Commission, because that's their reasoning of stormwater and that they don't want to put it in, under the jurisdiction of the Drain Commission, and then that becomes another issue for a new tenant.
So if what you could require is that the site plan be developed and shown with 35 spaces currently, but show the additional spaces, the additional 21, for future expansion of parking if required, either for this particular use or for any future use, any use in the future that might need it depending on the use. If a restaurant bar went in there, they're going to need more than 35 spaces, guaranteed. I can almost guarantee you that, based on existing popular restaurants in our community that have insufficient parking. So that's that. And then Jody's idea is good from the standpoint that it be reviewed by all outside agencies to make sure that it will in fact comply in the future if additional spots or spaces are needed by the Drain Commission, that it would comply with all required setbacks, that we would have enough green space to separate zoning districts if that's required or necessary in this application, things like that.
The applicant.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to add to that we have done that before. We call them deferred spaces, and we show them, We would show them on the plan like light shaded, and delineate them separately in the site data, that shows what we're providing. We would call them out as deferred spaces for future construction. And then the important aspect of that I think is kind of what they were getting to here, is that you would design your stormwater management facilities, which we've actually already done, because right now our current site plan, remember, we're showing all 56, sorry. So, and our stormwater management facilities are designed to treat all 56. So those facilities would be a little oversized, and I can't guarantee that the county stormwater regulations won't change in the next 20 years, because they're constantly changing, and we're seeing more severe rain events and all those things. But we could at least design it to the current standards for 56, but then defer the 21 along the north side, just leave it grass, but show that it could work.
Mm-hmm.
I like that.
Mr. Potter?
Is there, I like that idea. I was walking in here with a no in my head. If that were to be possible, to approve it as laid out, but down the road give a future owner-operator of the building, the ability to add spaces without having to come back to the board or whatever. If the, I don't know, could it be worded in such a way that if the drain requirements change in the meantime, the builder would be held to today's drain requirements and not 2035? Does that make sense, what I'm?
It makes sense, but I don't, it's dangerous in doing that, because as, things change, when it comes to drainage and infrastructure, things change generally for a legitimate reason. So I'd rather see it the other way. It could be engineered for today's standards, but you make part of your decision that if in the future those standards change, that any future development of that site would have to comply with the future developments as it relates to drainage, et cetera.
It probably doesn't even need to be stated, because it would have to anyway.
Yeah, well, I think the safe thing to do would be to state it, that the site would have to be engineered and designed such that 56 spaces could in fact be put in. Drainage could be supplied for those 56. 35 are approved now for this particular use, but if the use changes, ownership and use changes, that it wouldn't have to come back to the Board of Zoning Appeals, but it would it would have to be approved by the Planning Commission in a new site plan review for change of use. And Dennis and Jody, I think that would be required if the not necessarily if ownership changes, but if use changes and they do modifications to the building, et cetera. Would that be your thought on that issue?
And I think that's the only difference here, is the uses that would change that I think would make it more restrictive would be a restaurant, because a restaurant only requires 75 square feet per usable floor space, which would then, depending on the layout of the structure. But unless they don't come back to Dennis or the building or the planning department, sometimes it's difficult, such as the example Mr. Goldsmith gave, the plaza, that when those uses change, if there was already a restaurant there, sometimes they don't advise us that their new use is going in. I think in this case, if the use was to change in a significant way of the life safety plan and showing all those requirements, it's done administratively with the planning and the building department, because I can't say it will be Dennis and I.
Just phrase it this way: if ownership, lessee, or use changes for this parcel, they're subject to coming back to the Planning Commission for a new site plan review and approval for the site, and they're subject to incorporating additional parking spaces that were provided by the initial site plan, but not actually built out. If that, I don't want to influence you one way or the other. Again, we have an ordinance. We have a number of parking spots that are required for this use. Mr. Lakes identified a practical difficulty. You have to decide whether you agree with that practical difficulty that would allow you to deviate from the ordinance and allow this site to be built with 35 spots, but provide for the additional 21 if ownership, the lessee, or the use changes. It will require a new site plan review and the addition of parking spaces if warranted for any of those three things.
I just think that we have an ordinance. We know how many spaces are supposed to be there. We've already had one Dollar General get denied a variance by a previous BZA. I don't think there's any reason to change that at this time.
Yeah, if anyone's prepared to make a motion, I think we're willing to entertain it at this point.
One more
Potter?
comment, Mr. Chairman. The two layouts that I'm looking at show the building in the same place, the parking in the front the same place, and the parking along the side. It shows it in a manner that more parking could be added very easily along the north side. So it looks like it's amenable to the possible future addition of parking at the expense of somebody else. I guess it's always possible that between now and construction, the layout changes where it's no longer so easy to add more spaces. Is that a concern?
So you'd have to make it part of a motion that the site plan that will be approved by the Planning Commission must allow sufficient space for an additional 21 parking spots or spaces. So you have to have a parcel that's large enough and that meets the other requirements of the zoning ordinance in terms of setback, drainage, the capacity of the drainage, the size of the drainage to meet current standards, but that would in the future, with future site plan review, possibly need to be increased to meet any then existing standards as it might relate to drainage and the like. So that's a lot to think about, but I think you can cover that contingency by putting that type of language and make sure that Jody would know and she would be able to communicate to the Planning Commission. Our Planning Commission representative is excused tonight, but that Jody or Katrina will have I'm sure as they always do, have a good write-up that the Planning Commission can follow.
And one last comment, different subject, about the practical difficulty. The problem I have with the practical difficulty that's been proposed is that, well, I agree there's a little bit less grass area if we require the full amount of parking there. There's a little bit less grass area or green space if you want. But as far as surface water draining, yeah, there's going to be a little bit more surface water created by a larger parking space, but it's all going into a retention basin anyway. So the bulk, I believe, the bulk of the water that goes into the retention basin will still be infiltrated. So I guess I question the strength of of the practical difficulty that's been proposed. So that's it.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, can I just address Mr. Potter's two comments that you had? So the first comment was just to make sure that the room for those additional 21 spaces would be provided on the site plan. So what we would do as part of our site plan resubmittal is to actually show those 21 spaces, but show them light, dashed,
Okay.
showing that they're compliant in that location, but deferred to a future date when they're needed. And the system, the stormwater system would be designed to handle that runoff. But per the county's requirements to your second comment about it's all going to a retention pond anyway. So per the county drain commission's requirements, we have to provide stormwater detention. So we will be releasing water. So stormwater detention, there's no guarantee that we're going to be able to infiltrate all that water. We're just basically holding back the peak runoff.
Mm-hmm.
But there will still be more water released into the system, but just over time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, anytime you add impervious area to a site, you are sending more water downstream. Unless you have a massive infiltration system and great sandy soil, it's going downstream. You're just taking the peak. So you're not getting like surcharge storm systems, but you're still releasing that water over time. So it will, eliminating 21 spaces will reduce runoff.
Yeah, but most soil in the township is
Clay,
sand or sandy loam.
not this site.
Oh, it isn't?
No,
Oh.
unfortunately.
Ms. Rector?
I just had a question. If the board would look at the C100 of the submittal of the zoning appeals and then the C205 of the site plan, is there adequate room for maneuverability for where you propose your loading and unloading? Because that would still be required by planning.
I mean, we're going to have to look at all that. Yeah, we may have to pave a little bit more than just those spaces to get the maneuverability to work. We'll have to look at that. Because if you look at the two plans, and I was going to do an overlay just to help us see it, and I didn't have time. We actually, to get all the spaces along the north side, I was talking about, at first when we looked at the site, we're like, there's no way we can get all these spaces. We started looking at ways to squeeze them in. And we actually had to shift the driveway a little bit to the south because the driveway in the Board of Zoning Appeals set, you'll notice that it gets kind of close to that property line where it connects into Lewis Avenue. So that driveway had to get shifted a little south. So that shifted driveway would remain how it is, and there'd actually be more of a consistent green space along the north property line there. But we're going to show all the spaces. We're just going to change some of them to deferred.
Now I'm confused. I got a question. So for loading here, right, for unloading, that's something we didn't discuss, right? So I'm kind of confused on your point, Mr. Rector.
To make it easy, that'll be a site plan review
Okay.
element that will be considered by the Planning Commission, and they'll have to show an adequate loading and unloading area that would allow for that 35 spaces plus an additional 21.
But I think what you're saying is that regardless of the number of spaces, the driveway is going to be a particular width. In either instance, the driveway is a particular width intended for us. I think we're talking loading a semi-truck, right? That's going to, there's no, I don't imagine dispute about that, is going to have to back up into the parking lot. I mean, that, to your point, Phil, regardless of the number of spaces, that's how it's going to have to be done, and it's going to have to be done in a manner that allows for that to occur, right?
Yes.
Okay.
I think I'm prepared for a motion.
All right, Mr. Lake?
My motion is that we approve the variances based on practical difficulties of, we want to reduce the 3,400 square feet of impervious blacktop, decrease the amount of water runoff from the site, and increase green buffer space. This is, of course, contingent on a few things. And first, if ownership, lessee, or use changes, it's subject to site plan review for future space use. It's contingent upon land split and site approval. Planning Commission must approve the plan that will allow for future 56 spaces, and also the future use be reviewed based upon usage. I think I already stated that, but the site plan reflect potential future use of the 56 spaces or engineered and designed into the site plan. And of course, reviewed by appropriate entities. I think I covered it. I could get everything. Any friendly amendments?
Is there support for the motion?
I agree with everything that was said. I just want to make sure, like you're saying, Jake, that we cover everything adequately. So the friendly amendments. I don't know if we can. Is there a way that we can kind of?
I can recap if you'd like.
Okay.
Okay, so it's of course contingent upon if the ownership changes,
Yep.
lessee changes, or use changes, the site be up for a site plan review.
That would be required.
That would be required, correct. Let me go, my notes are kind of jumbled here because I was running out of space on my paper. First thing, it's contingent upon land split and site approval.
Site plan approval by the Planning Commission.
Yes, yep. The site plan reflect potential future use, i.e. the 56 spaces be engineered and designed into the site plan. That site plan be reviewed by the appropriate entities like the Monroe County Drainage Commission. And there was one other one. The Planning Commission must approve the plan that will allow for the future 56 spaces.
Total.
Total. Correct.
35 now with an additional 21.
As a future potential.
Yes.
So the only question I have is then, and maybe it's to you, Phil, is that when it comes up, right, 20 years from now, somebody comes in and says, I'm going to redo this, right, and the site plan's going to be different. Does everything then default back to the current, whatever the ordinance is at that time? So if, ABC store wants to come in 25 years from now and says, I'm going to change it to this type of store, that we're going to shift things around, is the default setting then the number of parking spaces in the ordinance? Or do they inherit that variance?
The baseline would be the approval, if you do approve it this evening, then I would want that to be further established in the site plan approval. And the site plan should, by the Planning Commission, reference what you've done tonight and have that attached to the site plan, just as the motion was proposed by Mr. Lake. That's the baseline. But if in 20 or 30 years from now, our ordinance has changed and fewer spots or spaces would be required, that would take precedence over what we've done here tonight. This is based on our ordinance as it exists now. And if those required number of spaces are required in 20 or 30 years from now, when use changes or ownership changes or the lessee changes, then that would be the baseline, and the Planning Commission would determine whether or not they'd have to add those 21 spaces or maybe 10 spaces or whatever the site plan review process would dictate as being appropriate for that site at that time. It gives them the flexibility. In other words, you don't have a number of 35 that runs with the land,
Right.
and that cannot be changed in the future. But if our ordinance changes,
Yeah,
and
of course.
and fewer spaces
Right,
are required, then that would apply.
I just like the idea, myself, I like the idea of that being opened up, right, when potentially that new business comes in and we potentially have some insight that says, hey, that 35 spaces, I wouldn't be on that board, I suppose, but the Planning Commission would then have that ability to say, we know that this type of business needs more than 35. We want your site plan to grab on to 10 or 20 or 21 of those spaces
That would give the planning commission the authority to do that.
Right.
And so it needs to be documented in the Board of Zoning Appeals records and documented in the final site plan. I'd like to see it shown on the site plan, and it would be shown on the site plan and the extra spaces shaded
Right.
with all the engineering appropriate to meet the standards
Right.
of today.
Ms. Rector?
I just asked for clarification. When you state that it has to be approved by the entities, do you mean today or in the future? Should the use change?
Should the use change? Yeah, today. So I think what we had talked about before, unless I misunderstood, is that we want, like Monroe County Drainage Commission, to review the site plan as if it were to have 56.
Okay, I just want to make sure that that you're not saying, because normally it doesn't, when a use change, it doesn't go back to the planning commission, it comes to the planning and the building department. We review it for compliance by ordinance. Should it have to go through site plan approval process, then it would go to the planning commission. I just want to make sure we're looking at it as designed today of Monroe County Road Commission, Drain Commission, Township standards.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
That's perfect.
But, we don't have to even worry about 20 or 30 years from now if we just keep it status quo.
You're right. You are right.
Just like the Dollar General on Lewis Avenue. Their variance was denied. We don't have to worry about it. A future board has.
Correct, but we can't take parking spaces away.
So, my last question regarding that matter, though, then is what Mr. Lake said in terms of the contingencies align, I guess, with what we're saying. I think it does. That by doing things the way it's proposed, it would allow for that kind of that flexibility for a future board to on the planning commission to assess or reassess what had been done for that and for potentially adjust as needed and use up some or all of those spaces in the future.
Yes.
I think what he's saying aligns, but
Yeah,
I just want to make
that's
sure,
it.
I guess, from your perspective.
To be totally honest with you, when any business goes into business, they worry about parking, right? So the ability to put it in, if they need it, they will put it in.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's,
It's to answer your question, Jeff, yes.
Okay.
The motion as proposed, it hasn't been supported or seconded yet, I don't think. But the motion as proposed would give the planning commission jurisdiction and authority to require additional parking spaces if the use, ownership, or the lease status changes.
And I like it.
Is that support to bring it to vote?
Support. I like it.
All right, Ms. Rector, if you would call the roll.
Mr. Lake,
Yes.
Mr. Wilson,
Yes.
Mr. Potter,
No.
Mr. Gore,
No.
Mr. Dersch.
Yes.
Motion carried.
Thank you for your time tonight with us. Looking for any public comment, as I don't see anyone in the audience tonight. We'll bring it to board and staff comments, starting down on my right.
Sorry. I would like to let everybody know we will be having a meeting on February 6th. It's a Monday night. Not a change in the meeting date, but we have an application already submitted, so there will be a meeting. Other than that, I have nothing. Welcome, Mr. Potter, and thank you for serving tonight, Mr. Wilson.
Nothing to report from me. Thank you.
I have nothing.
I have nothing.
Thank you, everyone, for the discussion tonight. I hope everyone had a good, safe holiday, and welcome back to a new year.
I'm good.
Okay. I'm good. Thank you.
Just want to say thanks for all the great debate. I really do enjoy this board, and I just hope we're all not driving electric cars in 20 years.
I have
A
nothing.
lot of
Thank you.
sites have those electric vehicle plug-ins.
All right, looking for a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Support? All in favor?
Aye.
Motion carried.